Hi, everybody. Welcome to LMG Security's MFA Day. We will be kicking off our MFA Day with our Microsoft Authentication workshop. My name is Natalie Adams, and I'm your moderator for today. Our presenter for the webinar today is Matt Duran. Matt Duran is the Director of Training and Response for LMG Security, a Black Hat instructor, and the co-author of the upcoming book, Ransomware and Cyber Extortion. A seasoned forensics professional, Matt specializes in incident response, ransomware cases, cryptojacking, and banking Trojans. He regularly conducts cybersecurity webinars and seminars for hundreds of attendees in all sectors, including banking, retail, healthcare, government, and more. Matt holds a bachelor's degree in computer science from the University of Montana and previously worked as a blue team field technician / system administrator for over 10 years. His malware research has been featured on NBC Nightly News. And Matt, at this time, I am passing you control of this workshop.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and thank you everyone for joining today. We are going to be covering some fairly in-depth technical stuff on multi-factor authentication, how it's rolled out, how you should plan for implementing multi-factor authentication into your overall security processes, and why this can be such a benefit to your users and to your organization's overall cybersecurity without causing too much trouble for users down the line in terms of their ability to actually access or interact with their systems. So the roadmap for today as a whole is going to cover multi-factor authentication rollouts for a couple of different services. And right now we're going to start with Microsoft's Office 365 system, kind of the big dog among the group. This is the most popular cloud-based email and application provider out there right now. And it is present in a lot of different office spaces, a lot of different industries, and we want to make sure that we are keeping this as secure as we possibly can. So to give you a quick rundown on what we're going to talk about, we're first going to go over why this is such an important piece of infrastructure to have in terms of your overall security program. We're going to go over the 5 steps that we put together to basically plan out your multi-factor authentication rollout and greatly increase your chances of a successful and easy rollout. Make sure that we're not running into any kind of unnecessary issues or roadblocks. And then we're actually going to walk through a few different ways that we can enable multi-factor inside of the Office 365 environment, or the Microsoft Office 365 environment more accurately. So if you want to follow along with this workshop, you will need a couple of things, and this is going to be just a basic rundown on how we set this up for a few different ways in the system. What you'll need to accomplish this is pretty straightforward: Office 365 subscription, a smartphone, and the Microsoft Authenticator application. This can be found in the Apple Store and the Google Play Store. It is a free application that can be downloaded directly onto your phone without really any kind of special setup or configuration needed. And if you want to go back through and follow us along later, remember these are going to be recorded and released out so people can come back and refer to them. So if you have any questions, or if there's something that you don't quite catch as we're going through, take another look at it as we move along, and hopefully everything gets answered. If not, reach out to us and we'll be happy to help you. So this becomes an important piece of our security architecture because of a couple of pretty basic facts. One, cloud usage is way up over the last couple of years. The figures you see in front of you here are a study that was done by Gartner, showing the average spending for organizations overall in the cloud atmosphere, basically. So we're looking at things like applications as a service, platforms as a service, software as a service, and the numbers you see in front of you are in millions. So this is not, when we're talking about cloud applications and infrastructure, this is not $136,000, this is $136 billion in overall spending by 2023. So you can see this is going to be a large piece of our overall infrastructure, whether we like it or not, moving here into the next few years. Now, along with this, and this great rise in the availability of cloud services, cybercrime is also way up, right hand in hand with that. And one of the major reasons for this is business email compromise. And again, this is one of the pieces that we want to point out as an essential guiding factor in why we need multi-factor authentication inside of our environments. The FBI is calling the rise in business email-based attacks a $43 billion headache, and it is a worldwide problem. It is not specific to any one industry. And by the numbers, this is actually more financially devastating than ransomware on a year-by-year basis. It doesn't get quite as much news coverage, doesn't get quite as much hype in the media, but it is a major problem. Now, we bring this up specifically because, and Microsoft themselves will admit this, there is one simple action you can take to prevent 99.9% of attacks against your account. And this is coming from Melanie Mays, the Senior Product Marketing Manager for Microsoft Security. That one simple action you can take, you guessed it, the use of multi-factor authentication. This is going to be one of the most important security controls you have in your environment. So we want to make sure that we are rolling this out effectively, efficiently, that we're covering applications that need to be covered, and that we're doing this in a manner that is secure and going to provide a benefit to us without, again, making things difficult for our user base. Now, multi-factor authentication is pretty straightforward. When we're talking about authentication, we're talking about a way to verify someone's identity. And when we're going over that in terms of the general cybersecurity landscape, what we really mean is three things: something you know, like a password; something you have, like a multi-factor authentication app or a key fob or something like that; and then something you are, which could be a biometric signature, so fingerprint scan, retinal scan, facial scan. There's a lot of different options there. If you're using more than one of these, you are using multi-factor authentication, and that's really what we want to go for. What we want is for a simple password theft to not result in a full network takeover, and the use of MFA can be a great tool in preventing that from happening. And again, this is going to be available for both cloud and local services, so we're not restricted to just your online accounts, so just your Office 365 or just your Google or whatever other online accounts you have. There are a lot of options for both internal and external implementations of this type of security system. So when we're talking about Microsoft's Office 365 system specifically, here are the MFA options that are compatible with Microsoft right out of the box. And these are ones that you can just link directly into your accounts and have access to. There are more that can work with Office 365, but we'll get to that a little bit later this afternoon. So we're talking about the Microsoft Authenticator app. That's probably going to be the easiest one to download and use. We have Windows Hello for Business, which is a facial recognition or biometric recognition system that's very common on newer Microsoft laptops. We have FIDO2 security keys. This is going to be a hardware dongle. We have OAuth hardware and software tokens, which are kind of in preview right now. But this is basically using your laptop itself as an identified device. Really cool how this industry is moving and how we're making things easier for users and not having to have that extra application running to do their MFA. They can just use the device they're already on, but we're not quite there yet. And then at the bottom of the list, and these are there intentionally, we have SMS or text message-based multi-factor authentication and voice call. The reason these are at the bottom of the list is that if we can avoid using them, we really want to. These are the least secure of the options that we have available. And if we can get away from using those less secure options that are vulnerable to things like intercepted text messages or voice fraud, then we're going to be in a lot better shape. Now, before we really get into the actual implementation of multi-factor, we need to talk about how we prepare for deployment. How do we get ourselves and our organizations ready to make what for some users can be a pretty substantial change to how they operate in their daily interaction with your software? So we've broken this down into 5 steps that you can run through to prepare yourself and your team for the inclusion of multi-factor as a daily part of your security program. So step 1 is pretty straightforward. If we want to protect our environment, we need to know what we are going to be able to protect, and this is why we do an inventory first. The very first thing we want to look at are the users, so we want to organize our users into their operational priority groups, know who's going to be a high-risk user, who may need to have a slightly more restrictive multi-factor authentication implementation versus who is someone that can be prompted for a code every 30 days or something like that. We want to make sure that we understand who those people are ahead of time. The next thing we need to look at are the applications that are in use inside of our environment. Not every application is compatible with multi-factor authentication. That's just the reality of the situation that we're in. We also need to look at where those applications sit. So are we using mostly cloud-based applications, which are going to be likely more conducive to multi-factor authentication because they're going to be a newer protocol? We are looking at on-premise applications. So how do we integrate our security into that? And then do we have any legacy applications in the network that flat out are not going to work with a multi-factor rollout? They will not have the feature implemented. They probably never will. So how do we identify and then account for those along the way? We also need to look at the devices that are in use inside the network, specifically when it comes to things that interact with a cloud-based email system, things like scanners, printers, and multifunction devices that are used for data transfer. In a lot of cases, those devices themselves are not specifically built to interact with the modern authentication methods and multi-factor authentication protocols that are in use by Office 365. We'll show you how to get around that here in just a second. And then also look at any existing security controls that you already have in place and make sure they're not going to conflict with your multi-factor rollout or cause any other problems for you down the road. Now, it's impossible to get all of this on a first shot. You may run into problems later on with an application or a service that you didn't really account for at first. Don't panic, it's fine. We can update our plan as we go. None of this is set in stone, but it's good to get that baseline out of the way first. The other tip we want to toss out here is to check if your applications that you're using or planning on using actually support multi-factor authentication. And there are a few different ways you can do that. There's documentation from the manufacturer or software vendor themselves that will tell you whether or not it's an available option. There's also directory services that are available where you can go in and put in the name of a service or application and see if it's listed as supporting multi-factor authentication. One of the ones that we've found recently that has been pretty comprehensive has been the 2FA directory. So if you go to 2fa.directory/US, you can look at the available options for cloud services, for communication, for domain control services that support multi-factor authentication. So take some of the work off your own plate at that point. All right, step number 2, we need to evaluate the options we have available for multi-factor authentication. There is a plethora of options out there, and some solutions may be better suited for your environment than others. So we need to know what's available for the services we have and what our users are going to interact with well. There are going to be some applications inevitably where SMS-based or text message-based or email-based multi-factor may be your only choice. If that's the case, anything is better than nothing, so go ahead and move forward with that, but don't rely on that as your sole source if you have better options available for you. We also need to identify multiple MFA methods, like at least 2 options for those users who are going to be interacting with the system. This is going to cover the team members that we have that don't necessarily have a smartphone or don't want to use their own device for any kind of work-related options. We can move them into something like a YubiKey, a Titan security key, a code-generating key fob, something like that. There's a lot of options out there for the support we're looking for. And then we need to look at supported MFA applications themselves. Are we allowing users to use any code generation piece of software they want, or are we going to restrict that down to very specific options that our IT staff and our technical staff can have some dominion over and can actually manage correctly, as opposed to a piecemeal where some people are using the Microsoft Authenticator while others are using something else. Just things to keep in mind as you move forward. Step 3 along the way is going to be to update your documentation. MFA in a lot of cases is a new addition to a security policy, and that needs to be added into the policy as a formal piece of the overall plan. This needs to be integrated into things like your acceptable use policies, and especially important are going to be your bring your own device policies. In a lot of cases, that smartphone that your users are relying on is going to be their multi-factor authentication source, and if they're running on BYOD, so they're running on their own personal devices, then we need to be able to account for that and have policies in place that will allow some governance of those applications. Obviously, we're not asking to completely take over a user's phone, but we need to have some policies in place as far as what the expectation of either service quality or hardware security policies are going to look like. We also need to review our risk versus our regular MFA requirements. So think about the frequency that you want users to have to represent a code. Is this going to be a service where every time a user logs in, they have to enter a code? Is it going to be regardless of their login status, every 30 minutes they have to enter one, which could be for a higher security environment? Or is it a user that can go for 30 days between MFA code prompts and still be perfectly fine? Again, these are things that we want to have mapped out ahead of time. We also want to look at things like the risk factors associated with our specific team members' responsibilities. Do they work in finance? Do they handle confidential information? And geographical policies. Are we prompting for MFA based on where a user is logging in from, when they're logging in? Again, these things need to be considered. And then there's some factors that we need to have in place just for the normal usability of our system. We want a balance of security and functionality. We don't want to make our systems completely unusable for our user base. We want to account for regulatory or contractual requirements that we may be beholden to. So there may be certain types of MFA implementations that will work with our trusted vendors and partners, but will not work with others. So we need to know that ahead of time. And then we want to consider advanced policies for high-risk users. If you're turning on MFA the same for everyone in your organization, that's a good start. But for users who have a higher risk to the overall organization safety, we want to make sure that we're accounting for that and being a little bit more stringent with those policies. Now, we got a question from the audience on this one about this, because we're talking so much about leaning on devices as or external devices as our multi-factor source. What happens if a device is lost or stolen? And this is something that needs to be addressed when we get our rollouts put together. First, we need to provide our users with an easy method to report this to our technical staff. If they lose their phone, if the phone is broken, if they lose their YubiKey or something like that, they need to know exactly who to contact and how to contact them in order to get that situation resolved. BYOD can also be unpredictable. If you're relying on users to supply their own hardware for multi-factor and you don't really have control over that hardware, you're not really going to be certain as to what exact piece of hardware that's going to be. We don't know which version of Android or iOS they're going to be running. We don't know if it's an iPhone X or an iPhone 13. There's a lot of uncertainty there, so we need to be able to plan ahead for that level of uncertainty. Also, again, plan for phones and hardware keys to be broken or lost. In a perfect world, this would never happen, but in reality, we've all broken a phone or lost a key ring or something like that at some point or another, so just plan for that to happen. Know how to clear sessions from your users if one of these devices does get out there in the wild, and also if you're able to do so, know how to remotely wipe any sensitive content that may be contained on that device. This is going to be more for managed devices that your organization has a little bit more assertive control over, but there are ways that this can be done on devices that are BYOD without completely bricking the phones. It's basically just taking your own corporate data off of there. Something to watch out for. All right, step 4, moving forward, we need to create our deployment strategy. This is not something that we just want to turn on and go with one day. Users are going to hate you for it, and it's going to make for a really bad time for your technical staff. What we want to do is test first. Use a small group of users with varying levels of technical skill. Some of these users are going to be able to implement their own multi-factor just by having you turn it on and make it an available option for them. It's a pretty straightforward process in a lot of cases. Other users may have difficulty with this. So by identifying where the roadblocks are going to come up ahead of time, this can greatly smooth out the rollout down the road now that you know kind of what to look for and how to fix those problems. We want to identify the core users that are going to be the primary focus of our deployment. Who is it that needs to have their multi-factor turned on first? And then we want to deploy this incrementally. We don't want to, again, just flip this on for the entire organization all at the same time. We're inevitably going to run into problems at that point if that's the route that we take. So we do this slowly. We take a measured approach to this, and we make this a much easier change in overall security policy for everyone. Also, plan for remote employees. If you're working with a lot of employees who are either not in your office or not in your geographical area, then there may be some difficulty providing them with technical support. And if that is the case, we need to have a plan in place for how we work with those employees to, one, get them included in the MFA rollout, but not alienate them or make them feel stressed out about this new feature of their security program. Managed and unmanaged devices, again, also need to be accounted for. Are the devices that users are relying on for their MFA going to be controlled by our overall IT staff? Or is this something where we are going to have a little bit of control, but the user ultimately has full authorization over the device? And then we have to plan to change the strategy as needed as we move through. There may be things that we identify in our early plan that are not going to be worthwhile moving down the road. So we need to be nimble about our deployment strategy. All right, last but not least, we need to inform our users of the change. Again, this is not something that we want to be a surprise. We don't want people to walk into work one morning and have absolutely no clue that this was going to be happening. Again, this is going to cause stress. This is going to cause misuse of the system, and all of those things can greatly impact our ability to safely and securely roll out this type of service for our teams. Coordinate internally with things like human resources, with your leadership, with public relations, with your help desk, and again, do this in advance. We also need users to understand why this is such a big deal, why this is something that we are going to be implementing in our environment. Where as technical staff and as security staff, we're not doing this because we enjoy seeing people struggle to access their online services. There's a good reason to have this in place. And if your users understand why we do this and understand the true benefit to having the service available to them, then they're going to be much more receptive to including that, not just in their professional lives, but also in their personal lives. We recommend multi-factor on every service that you have available, regardless of if it's inside your organization or not. And this is a great way to at least get your foot in the door in getting people used to that kind of culture around security. And then again, we're going to hammer on this one. Prepare documentation on usage and give your users advance notice. We want this to go for quite a while before we pull the trigger and make this a full-on requirement. Now, on that note, we had another question about lead time. So how much time should I plan for in order to deploy multi-factor authentication successfully? And of course, as with most things in the technical industry, the answer to this is it kind of depends. There is no one answer for every situation. If you're working in a small organization that only has 5 employees, odds are pretty good you don't need to do a whole lot of future planning to get multi-factor rolled out to your team. However, if you have 10,000 employees, this can be a much different scenario. So in general, we like to tell people to allow at least 8 weeks for the full deployment of multi-factor authentication. There's a couple of good reasons for that. We'll go over them here as we go through. Again, this will obviously vary based on the size and complexity of your organization, what type of industry you work in. We also want you to anticipate delays. This may not go as smoothly as you're hoping it will. That is the case with most most rollouts of new services. So we don't want to become frustrated and start skipping steps because we are not happy with the cadence and the speed at which this is being deployed. And then regularly remind users throughout that 8-week period. So we want to start with that initial email at 8 weeks. We want to let them know again at 6 weeks, again at 4 weeks, again at 2 weeks, 1 week, 5 days. As we go through, we want to make sure that everyone is well aware that this is happening, and we don't want to wait until this is an emergency to roll this out. All right, so really quick, just deployment prep. Inventory your environment, know what you need to protect and how you can protect it. Evaluate your options for multi-factor, know that you have secure solutions for everything that you need. Update your documentation accordingly, create your deployment strategy, and then inform your users that this is going to be going out the door. Now, with Microsoft's Microsoft's Office 365 system, they have actually provided you with some great documentation ahead of time that you can leverage to make this a much easier transition for your users. And this is available free of charge to anyone that wants it. Microsoft has put together a great deployment pack that has things like PowerPoint slides, posters, email reminders, and instructional sheets for your team to let them know that this change is coming and what they need to do to actually account for this in their daily work. Here's what a couple of those look like. So we have passwords aren't enough, keep the bad guys out. These can be sent out to your staff well ahead of time before we make multi-factor a complete requirement inside the environment. And one of the nice things about this too is up at the top of the wording on the PowerPoint itself, we actually have a link that we can direct users to configure their own devices if they're able to do so. So that aka.ms/mysecurityinfo will take you right into the multi-factor authentication configuration section of Office 365. And again, for technically savvy users, let them do the work on their own. This will save you time, it'll save them hassle, and it's just easier for everyone. As a bonus, if we're using the Microsoft Authenticator through either iOS or Android, this acts as a bonus password manager. So if you don't already have a password manager solution in place in your office, so something like Dashlane or 1Password or LastPass or something like that, this can be at least a stand-in until you have one of those more robust solutions in place. So far, the password testing feature is still in development, but so far it's looking pretty good, and it looks like there is a good use case for portability across systems. This is also available as a browser add-on for Chrome and for Edge, and it'll allow you to store, sync, and backup passwords across devices. Also free to use, so that's always a nice little way to have that as an extra piece of your security toolkit. All right, so there are 3 different ways to enable MFA that we're going to talk about today in the overall run-through. And there are going to be varying situations where one of these might be appropriate while the other one might not. But in general, we're going to go over enabling multi-factor for individual users. We're going to go over enabling multi-factor via what's called security defaults. And then we're going to go over conditional access policies. And these are going to be the more complex ways of deploying multi-factor in your environment, but you also get a lot more granular control over exactly how those implementations look. Okay, so moving forward, if we want to enable MFA for an individual Office 365 user or just for everyone on our user list all at the same time, it's a pretty straightforward process. We can go directly into the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. So just go to portal.office.com, log in with your admin credentials, and then click on Admin, and you're basically there. Once we're in there, we need to click on active users, and in the panel that comes up on the right-hand side of the screen that lists all of our active users, we're going to see an option for multi-factor authentication. All we have to do is click that, and we are into the configuration items for the overall tenant. It's that simple. A couple of tips here. If we want to do this for specific groups of users inside of our organization, we can do that to a point using this method of implementation. This is going to go for things like sign-in allowed users, which is going to be pretty much everyone. We can also narrow down to things like billing administrators, global administrators, and affect those individual groups without affecting the organization as a whole. Again, it depends on how you want to do your rollout, but it's a pretty good way to go about it. Now, as we mentioned before, not all multi-factor authentication is created equal. Anything is better than nothing, but if we have the option to not use less secure methods of multi-factor like SMS or like email, we should absolutely do that. There are multiple ways that email and text messages can be intercepted or can be otherwise misused. If you are going to use SMS for your multi-factor authentication system, then as an added step, add a PIN or a passphrase to your cellular account. That way somebody can't call into your mobile provider, pretend to be you, and basically redirect that information to go to their phone instead of yours. This is something that we see happen somewhat frequently in the wild, so it's definitely something that we want to account for. All right, so this brings us up to our tip, turn off weak MFA. So if you have email, phone call, and SMS available, but you don't need them, avoid them. Otherwise, applications, tokens, biometric authentication, and hardware tokens are going to be a lot more secure. If you want to know more about this, we have a Beyond Passwords webinar that we did not too long ago. I highly recommend you check that out. We cover a lot of this in more detail because we frankly don't have the time for it today. But check it out and let me know if you have any questions. All right, so very first, before we do anything else, we need to clear out settings. And this is one of the kind of common hurdles that we run into in environments where IT staff has turned over or changed hands or something like that throughout the the overall life of the business. If there was an IT member or IT staff member or security staff member who attempted to do a multi-factor rollout or was playing around with it, there may be settings included that are going to make things difficult for us. So the very first thing we need to do is go into manage user settings, and we need to clear out the available settings that are already there. We want to start from a blank slate and move forward. Next, we actually need to configure our multi-factor authentication service settings, and this can be done from that same multi-factor authentication menu we got to from the admin portal. Pretty straightforward. The first thing we need to do is set some basic security defaults. So are we going to allow application passwords? This is going to be for those legacy or less technologically advanced devices, things that can't function with multi-factor right off the bat. If we are going to allow those to interact with our system, then the application password is probably going to be our best bet. So we'll go ahead and allow that. And this will allow users to enable their own application passwords for things like their email clients, if that is something that is not going to work correctly with the overall MFA. We can also whitelist by IP addresses. So if somebody's coming in from inside of our network, or if they're coming in from a trusted location, we can put that IP into a whitelist and make it so a user does not necessarily have to re-enter an MFA code just based on their network location. Now, we want to caution you, by doing this, you are creating a bypass for MFA. So if there is a local malware infection on a workstation or something like that, and an attacker is able to gain an interactive session and log in through the browser, multi-factor is not going to save them at that point because it's coming in from a trusted location. So balance security and usability. If that's something that you can find yourself being comfortable with, then go for it. Otherwise, usually I leave that one turned off, just as a matter of speaking. All right, the next thing we need to do is configure our verification options. What are we going to allow our users to actually utilize to either receive the codes they need to log into their account or to generate these things? And again, inside the verification options, we've gone ahead and disabled call to phone and text message to phone because we have better options for Office 365, quite frankly. So we're going to go with those instead. The other thing we can adjust from this screen is the multi-factor authentication on trusted devices. If you have a device that a user is almost always going to be logging in from a system on, can we trust that device by its own hardware signature and not have to enter into that MFA prompt as frequently as we would normally do? In a lot of cases, this is going to be an okay thing to enable. Just make sure you don't keep your number of days too high on this one. You can go anywhere between 1 and 365 days. I would argue that about 10 days is probably as long as you want to go on that. And that will keep your users refreshed with their current multi-factor authentication codes without causing too much hassle for them. Again, this will differ in your environment, but something to keep in mind. Okay, so once we enable multi-factor for selected users, Microsoft is going to warn us. It's going to ask, are you sure you want to turn on multi-factor authentication? And it's going to give us things like a deployment guide and that setup link to provide out to our users. We highly recommend taking advantage of that. Microsoft has done a lot of the work for you, and there's no need to reinvent the wheel on this one. Once we're ready to go, though, all we do is click Enable Multi-Factor Authentication, and we are good to go. The next time the user signs in, this is probably what they're going to see. It's going to say more information required. The very first thing it's going to ask is how it can contact you and verify your identity initially. This is usually going to be done through either a text message or a mobile app. If you already have the app, go ahead and use the app. This can be selected from the drop-down menu, and it will get your user familiar with using that application to provide that second verification step. And again, the link to do this on your own is right there at the bottom of the slide. It can also be found in Microsoft's documentation material. Okay, so once the user has their application configured, they need to link it into Office 365. And the easiest way to do this is by using a QR code that gets generated on the screen while you're setting up the multi-factor authentication. All the user has to do at this point is click Add a New Item on their Authenticator app, scan this QR code, and they're basically in the door at that point. Very straightforward method of doing this, and very difficult to do this wrong, which is one of the reasons why we like it so much. There are also manual steps down at the bottom. There's a custom URL you can put in and a code that you can enter to sync yourself up with the system. But again, it's easier if you can just scan the QR code and get yourself into the system automatically. Again, your user is going to thank you for that as well. Makes it a lot easier. Also consider your fallback plan. Is there a specific method that you want users to adhere to if they are not going to be able to access that device? So if the phone is broken, or if there is some other circumstance where they're not able to get to their MFA app, do we allow for a less secure verification option as a stopgap? So are we going to allow for call and text, or are we going to require IT to reset this manually based on the user's initial prompt? Something to keep in mind. Application passwords, as we mentioned before, are generated by the user. These are passwords that are used in place of your normal password for less secure devices, and they are something that we want to keep a very close eye on, because remember, this is going to be a bypass for our MFA system, and we don't want to leave too many holes available for someone to exploit like this. Okay, moving forward. So now we have our setup finished. One thing that we want to remember is that we want those less secure options turned off. So the prompt you see right there in the middle still has text and phone call available. Remember to disable those if you can. The prompt that you see on the right-hand side of the screen does not have those available because they've been disabled for the account now. So again, make sure we are covering all those bases. Okay, next up, let's go for a different method of rolling out multi-factor. So we've done the individual user method. That can be a little bit of a pain, especially if you have a large organization. So what happens if you just want to enable multi-factor authentication for absolutely everyone all at the same time? Well, Microsoft has an available option for that, and you can do this using their security defaults function inside of O365 specifically. All we have to do that is go into our Azure dashboard, go into properties, and there is an option for manage security defaults right there. As soon as we hit yes, that will allow us to go ahead and turn these on for everyone. And like I said, it's basically the easy button for rolling out MFA. It'll give you a quick warning just saying, are you sure you want to enable security defaults? You click yes, and then the next time the user logs in, just like we saw before, they will see that multi-factor authentication screen. The other nice part about doing it this way, though, is you get some good lead time. So the default right out of the box is 14 days. Meaning a user who is not ready to fully pull the trigger on MFA for their own account can bypass this for a little while, not forever, but long enough that they can get a little bit more familiar with the idea and kind of reconcile what the change is going to look like inside of the system. All right, so once we have that enabled, on the next user login, we see a prompt like this. This is going to ask us to keep our account secure, and this is going to be a little bit easier of a method to roll out MFA when we're or for the user to roll out MFA when we're using security defaults. Again, it's a little bit more accessible looking. It's fewer steps, and it's a little bit easier to do. In the end, though, we are still going to go ahead and turn this on, get our QR code, scan that QR code, and link in with a regular MFA app. And the user can do this from pretty much any device. So that's pretty handy to work through. We can do this from the mobile phone, or we can do it from the computer itself. There are a lot of options for us. Another question that we get pretty frequently is, can you restrict what devices a user sets up as their MFA device? And the answer for Microsoft is yes, but with some limitations. There are some very specific ways that you need to implement multi-factor authentication to be able to have control over this. Just doing it via security defaults or just doing it via the overall user panel is going to basically allow for any device to be used. If we want to change that, then we need to look into a little bit more restrictive policies and a little bit more targeted approach to the deployment of MFA. We can do that using what are called conditional access policies. Now, for IT staff, these are going to be the most granular method that you have of deploying multi-factor authentication and other security settings out to your environment. And you can do this for individual users, individual groups, and a lot of other options. Now, to use these, you do need to have a minimum subscription level through Office 365. So for Microsoft 365 Business Premium customers, E3 and E5 customers, or those of you that have Azure Active Directory Premium P1 or P2 licenses, this feature will be available. If you're on E1 or if you're on Business Basic, you may not have this, but it might be worth your money to bump up your subscription at that point, because the added security you get is substantial enough that it's worth the extra money going into it. This is a very, very highly customizable way of rolling out these security policies to your organization as a whole, but it's important to keep in mind that you cannot use this with security defaults. There will be a conflict here, and the system will basically default back to security defaults instead of using your conditional access policies. That doesn't do you a whole lot of good, so let's just skip that part to start with. All right, so to start, we need to figure out who we are going to be deploying these policies for, and that is, again, something that we ideally would have identified early in the process as we were mapping out our deployment strategy. To do so, we can select from the conditional access policy menu whether we're going to be using all users, whether we're going to be using selected users and groups, and all of that can be identified right here in the basic setup menu for these policies themselves. Then we want to configure some usage triggers. So we want to restrict what users can change inside the environment. So can they modify their own security info? Can they change their multi-factor authentication device on their own? Can they add new devices? All these things are set up in the access policy itself. So we can really nail down exactly what users are allowed to do, and more importantly, what they're not allowed to do. If we are allowing users to add new devices or to change their own devices, in some cases that can be a security issue for us. So we want to make sure that we're accounting for that as we go through. To interact with these, though, all we do is select them off the list, select what the action is going to be, and then move forward. Next, we can register application parameters. So we can set up multi-factor authentication to only trigger on very specific applications, or no applications, or cloud applications only, or really whatever we want to here. That's the beauty of this kind of a configuration. In this case, the example you see is going to look at cloud applications. So these are applications that a user can get from the Microsoft Store and can integrate into their overall usage of the Microsoft 365 system. We can choose whether we want to require multi-factor authentication. We can choose whether we want to exclude multi-factor or exclude the applications in general. And again, this is for application-specific policies. This is what we want to really get that granular control. The next thing we want to do is configure the last of our conditions. So are we looking at things like user risk as a factor when they are logging in? Is this someone who needs to represent a multi-factor authentication code every time they log in, every hour, every half hour, every month, every year? How is the actual configuration going to look on this? We can also include or exclude specific devices, either by manufacturer or operating system version, or a lot of other nice pieces to have in play here. And this, again, will give us that piece of granular application control that we really want in order to fully secure the environment. The only thing we have to do at this point is decide whether or not the policy we made is going to be a grant or block policy. So is this a policy that's going to allow someone to access the system, or is it going to deny them access to the system? And once we're there, we deploy, and we are more or less good to go just by enabling that access. Okay, so that's all we have for the Microsoft Office 365 section of the webinar for today. Make sure you join us. We have 2 more workshops today, which we'll go over here in just a second. But here's what we've accomplished. We covered the 5 steps to prepare for a multi-factor authentication deployment. We did a full setup of multi-factor authentication for both individual users, using security defaults inside of Microsoft's Office 365 system, and using conditional access policies. What we haven't done today is pretty significant, and why we recommend you watch the Duo webinar a little bit later today. We have not done a more advanced configuration on the multi-factor setup. We did just basically from a 10,000 foot view on this. This can get a lot more granular as you move through. We also didn't talk about non-Microsoft apps, and we didn't talk about single sign-on, which is something that will be or can be a very nice benefit for your organization. So check out our webinars later today, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. All right, well, that's it for me. If you need any help or have any questions with your multi-factor authentication needs, please feel free to contact me directly. You can get me at info@lmgsecurity.com, find us on Twitter, find us on LinkedIn, and let us know what you thought. Natalie, I'll turn it over to you for questions.
Great, thank you, Matt. We do have a question from one of the attendees. Do individual security defaults or conditional access require any specific Microsoft 365 license level?
Yeah, so security defaults can be enabled pretty much right out of the box. And actually, coming up in the next few months, Microsoft is going to be making those the default for Office 365 systems. So anything from E1 all the way up through the most expensive package you get out there will have access to that. Conditional access policies, as we mentioned before, do require a certain subscription level. And if you're curious whether or not you meet that subscription level inside of your Office 365 tenant, there is an automatic checker. I'll add a link when we do the PDF version of the slide. You can go in and check if your specific tenant level is appropriate to use conditional access policies, and if not, what you would need to increase as far as subscription level goes to be able to access those features.
Okay, great. Well, again, if anyone has any other questions, please feel free to reach out to Matt using his contact info on the screen. Matt, thank you for the great Microsoft authentication workshop. My name is Natalie Adams with LMG Security, and we would like to thank everyone who attended.